Ken Livingstone, the former Mayor of London, joins us live. Mr. Livingstone, thank you for coming on the programme. It's good to see you. Now, why do you think there's been such a difference in the mainstream media's coverage of the battles in Aleppo and in Mosul?
Well, I think the simple fact is that every war's been like that. I remember, through the Vietnam War, America's intervention led to almost 4 million Vietnamese dead. And yet all we were told was this was a Western struggle to prevent a communist takeover, whereas the Vietnamese just wanted control of their own country. And that's the reality. Every war we have seen horrendous levels of civilian casualties, and I watch RT, I watch the BBC, but each side puts a different perspective, and someone just watching Western television will have no idea about what you have just shown and revealed, and I think that's a tragedy.
Are you surprised at the lack of public outcry over the crisis in Mosul? I mean, after all, social media was packed with calls to stop the battle for Aleppo, but there's relatively little in comparison. What do you think's going on there?
Well, as I said, this is just the way wars are conducted. During a war, both sides rely on propaganda. They put their own case. The tragedy is, of course, most people in the West just looking at Western channels. It'd just be a lot better if more and more people tuned in, as I do, to RT and other foreign channels to actually see a different perspective on all of this. Otherwise, you never know about this. You never know about what's going on. If I just think back to the 1980s, we had British troops crossing over the border into the Republic of Ireland and killing not just IRA people, but a popular band, anything to stir up trouble. We were never told about this. It took 20 years of my asking questions in Parliament before finally it was accepted that our troops had been conducting murders in Ireland.
Indeed, we've seen recently, instead of reporting on Mosul, several mainstream sources prefer to cover the recent UN report, which is blaming Assad's troops and their allies for deliberate strikes on humanitarian infrastructure in Syria. Do you expect the same kind of UN and media attention to the bombings in Mosul?
Well, not just that. If you look, the horrendous bombings that are going on in Yemen, where British and American arms that have been sold to the Saudis are indiscriminately killing civilians, bombing schools, bombing hospitals, but virtually no one in the West gets to see anything about that. And basically, we have one or two good papers, The Guardian reports it, but for most people, they have no idea this is going on. I do think, as well, that whilst the UN is broadly a good institution, it has been predominantly in the pockets of American interests throughout most of my lifetime.
Well, the battle for Mosul is being presented as a decisive battle against ISIL, but really retaking Mosul doesn't necessarily mean defeating the terror group. Why do you think there's no talk about the future of the anti-ISIL battle that could affect more civilian areas?
Well, I think that part of the problem with all of this is that you've got to go back to the 1980s when America started funding Muslim fundamentalist groups. The Saudis were funding the most extreme, like Al-Qaeda and so on. And the West is in denial about Islamist terrorism has its origins going right back to the 1980s. And there were instances where President Carter was briefed by the CIA in 1979 saying, if we give arms to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, Russia will have to intervene to actually stop that, and it will create Russia's Vietnam. An absolute tragedy. But when Carter took the decision to do that, it never occurred to him he was lighting the fuse that would lead to 9/11. And the West has got to come to terms with the fact that we funded the creation of Islamist fundamentalism and the terror that has come from that. And we've got to make sure we stop. And that means pressure on Saudi Arabia, which remains the principal funder of the extremist terrorist groups in the Muslim world.
Washington has said it will investigate civilian casualties. Do you expect that investigation to open soon?
It might do But whether it will actually be an honest inquiry with real integrity coming up with the truth, I wouldn't bet my own money on that.
OK, Mr Ken Livingstone, former Mayor of London, thank you for sharing your opinion on this matter.
Thank you.